earlier that evening?
I learned that in jail.
For 30 long years, Sydney Brooke Simpson lived inside a silence the world mistook for privacy. But her silence wasn't protection, it was survival. While journalists, comedians, lawyers, and late-night hosts dissected her family's tragedy for entertainment, she lived with something they could never touch: memory. Not the courtroom headlines, not the televised verdict, something much darker, much quieter. The memory of a night in 1994 that cleaved her childhood into two irreconcilable halves. It didn't matter that her father was one of the most famous athletes in the world. It didn't matter that the trial became the most watched legal spectacle in television history. It didn't matter that millions debated guilt or innocence like it was a sport. For Sydney, none of that was real. What shaped her life was a single night she never escaped. The night the world called a crime scene, and she called the moment her life split into before and after. On June 12, 1994, Los Angeles police arrived at 875 South Bundy Drive in Brentwood. Outside, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman lay lifeless on the walkway. Upstairs, in a small bedroom filled with stuffed animals and pastel blankets, two children slept. One of them was 8-year-old Sydney. She had gone to bed in one world and would wake in another. The moment the police opened her door, the story she never asked to be part of began. And unlike the rest of the world, she would never get to turn it off. In the following days, cameras invaded Brentwood. Helicopters circled overhead. Reporters shouted questions no child should hear. And when the famous white Ford Bronco chased across the freeway, everyone watched everyone except Sydney, who was hidden with relatives, too young to understand the spectacle, but old enough to feel the fear in every adult's trembling voice. The world asked whether O.J. Simpson was guilty, but almost no one asked what the children had seen or heard or remembered. Only decades later, in a private written statement filed quietly in 2024, did Sydney reveal fragments of the night that never stopped echoing inside her. She recalled hearing footsteps, heavy ones, then something crashing, then a scream. After that, silence so deep it felt unnatural. In her statement, she described a moment when she saw, through the crack of a sliding door, a tall male figure near the back steps, with something dark trailing down his hands. At age 8, she couldn't name what she was seeing, but as she wrote in adulthood, "I didn't understand it, but I recognized it from that day on." When detectives interviewed her in 1994, she was protected from harsh questions. Lawyers and relatives insisted the children remain untouched by investigation. The official report simply said the kids were found asleep and unharmed. But the real damage wasn't physical. Trauma rarely leaves bruises you can photograph. It leaves pattern. At Brentwood Elementary, records later showed Sydney suffered panic episodes. She flinched at footsteps in hallways. She refused to sit near doors. Loud noises made her cry. She drew pictures of two houses, one bright and one dark. The dark one scribbled red around the door. A therapist called them trauma echoes, but the Browns, the family who took her in, shielded her as fiercely as they could. They turned down interviews, kept her out of public view, and never let cameras near her again. They knew the world wasn't finished with O.J. Simpson, but they wanted to prevent the world from consuming Sydney too. When the trial began in January 1995, the circus only grew louder. While the public dissected bloody gloves, DNA, timelines, and sound bites, Sydney lived the trial differently. To her, it wasn't entertainment. It wasn't justice. It was an endless reminder that her mother was dead and her father was accused. By the time the verdict was read on the 3rd of October 1995, and O.J. Simpson was acquitted, every living room in America erupted with cheers or outrage. But for Sydney, the moment brought no relief. One parent was gone forever, the other had become a stranger, and the world had an opinion about both. By 1996, child services reported recurring nightmares, social withdrawal, and deep anxiety. Teachers described Sydney as bright but emotionally distant. Her trauma didn't fade when the cameras did. It went quiet, burrowing inward, reshaping her childhood in ways the public would never see. The Browns eventually made a decision that changed the course of her life. Around 2000, they moved Sydney and her younger brother Justin to Florida, far from Brentwood, far from Los Angeles, far from the shadow of the Rockingham estate. Florida offered what they needed most: anonymity. At Gulliver Preparatory, Sydney was simply the quiet girl. Teachers said she avoided personal questions, deflected attention, and requested that her yearbook photo be omitted. She carried her last name like a secret, hoping no one would connect her to a story the world couldn't forget. But trauma shapes curiosity. In 2004, Sydney enrolled at Boston University, choosing to major in sociology with a specialization in criminology and deviant behavior. She never explained her choice, but she didn't have to. Her senior thesis analyzed the psychological impact of parental homicide on children, not as confession, but as analysis. Her professors praised her empathy, her insight, her emotional maturity. But beneath the academic language, she was studying the landscape of her own life. After graduating in 2008, she moved to Atlanta, working at a nonprofit supporting children affected by domestic violence. Co-workers described her as gentle, deeply empathetic, the sort of caseworker who could sit with a child's pain without flinching. During those years, she quietly wrote private notes, fragments of memories, thoughts she couldn't speak aloud. Those writings, discovered later in legal filings, revealed a struggle with identity, guilt, and truth. One line read, "I was taught to love him, but I remember being afraid of his voice." These were not journal entries. They were the pages of a childhood trying to make sense of itself. By 2010, she'd built a life of deliberate invisibility. No social media, no interviews, no public presence. Several times she moved to avoid being recognized. In a world where everyone shared everything online, she built walls instead. And behind those walls, she finally found peace until life forced her to confront the past once more. In 2017, when O.J. Simpson was released on parole after serving time for armed robbery, Sydney said nothing. She did not visit him. She did not reach out. She kept her distance for 2 years, until 2019, when she agreed to see him one final time. The meeting was short and heavy, 2 lives tied by blood but split by truth. O.J. handed her a copy of If I Did It and said, "If you read this, you'll understand me better." Sydney later said she knew, from that moment, that nothing had changed. His face held no confession. His eyes held no apology. She left without saying goodbye. Days later, she contacted a lawyer and took the first steps to legally sever all financial ties. On April 10, 2024, when O.J. Simpson died at age 76, the news flashed across every major network. For the world, it was an ending. For Sydney, the ending had already happened years earlier. She did not attend the funeral. She was not listed on the death certificate. She was not listed as next of kin. 3 months before his death, she filed a legal disclaimer rejecting all rights to his estate. In a statement released through her attorney, she wrote, "I choose what memory survives. I choose my mother." 6 words echoed louder in America than the entire 8-month trial. Sydney didn't deliver her truth through interviews or television appearances. She delivered it through action, legal documents, refusals, absences, signatures. Her silence became her testimony, and the world finally understood what that silence had been carrying all along. Today, Sydney Simpson lives in St. Petersburg, Florida, where she runs a successful real estate company under her full legal name. No pseudonyms, no initials. No attempts to hide, only a quiet reclaiming of who she is. Financial reports show her business thriving. Friends describe her as grounded, private, and deeply loyal to the few she trusts. In 2020, she married a partner outside the public eye. In 2021, she became a mother, naming her daughter after her own mother's middle name, a tribute whispered across generations. She donates anonymously to domestic violence shelters, women's safe houses, and programs for children who have witnessed trauma. She speaks rarely, avoids cameras, and declines interviews. But every choice she has made since childhood reveals a woman determined to break the cycle she was born into, not by shouting the truth, but by living it. Sydney Simpson's life is a reminder that even the loudest, most relentless storm eventually leaves room for quiet if someone is strong enough to step out of the wreckage and choose silence on their own term. There was never a dramatic courtroom confession waiting for her. No hidden tape. No last-minute revelation that would rewrite the headlines. Her story didn't end with the kind of cinematic twist the world always seems to crave. Instead, it ended with a woman reclaiming her life in the most powerful way imaginable, by refusing to let a tragedy she never asked for become the definition of her identity. For decades, she lived in a world where strangers debated her memories like they were entertainment. A world where her childhood became a national obsession. A world where people forgot that inside the circus was a little girl who had simply lost her mother. And yet, through all of that noise, Sydney carved out a life of quiet dignity, not by erasing the past, but by refusing to let it grip her future. She chose steadiness over attention, privacy over spectacle, peace over blame. She chose motherhood. She chose her career. She chose to build something gentle out of a childhood that was anything but. Her final acts, the legal disclaimers, the severed inheritance, the refusal to participate in anything tied to her father's legacy, weren't gestures of bitterness. They were declarations of independence. Proof that even after the world tries to write your story for you, you still hold the pen. Sydney didn't rewrite history. She simply stepped out of its shadow. And now, after nearly 30 years of silence, the quiet she found is not the fragile quiet of avoidance, it's the steady quiet of someone who survived the unthinkable and still managed to rise with grace, restraint, and an unshakable sense of who she wants to be. So what do you think of her decision to walk away from everything connected to her past? Could you have done the same, knowing the weight of the name she carried and the memories she lived with? Let us know in the comments. Your perspective matters. These conversations help keep the human stories behind the headlines alive. If you believe Sydney's strength deserves to be remembered, hit like, share this video, and subscribe for more untold histories the world tried to bury. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted in courtrooms or splashed across tabloids, they're the ones whispered by survivors who finally found the courage to choose their own ending